everybody, welcome back. Today I'm going to be using the Holiday Penguin stamp set by MFT, and I'm going to be using this palm tree from the Penguins in Paradise, which I believe is retired now. And you can see that the original or the newer stamp set comes with a regular Christmas tree, but today we are doing a tropical theme. So I did some light pencil marks just to kind of map out where my sand will be, where my water will be, and where my sky will be before I actually do my stamping. This will just kind of guide me as far as where I need to stamp my images. You can see that I have all of my masks pre-cut with some Simon Says stamp masking paper, and I still have the backing on this. I'm just kind of arranging this onto my card panel, which by the way is a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock cut down to 5.5 by 4 1/4. So I'm kind of just arranging my images to see how I am going to want these placed. Some of the penguins are facing certain ways, so I want to make sure that they're all facing the tree. Then I can remove those masks and replace them with the actual stamps. Now, none of these are actually overlapping, but because of the kind of the edge of the stamp, I only was able to stamp 3 to begin with and then the other 2. So once those were placed down, I can go ahead and stamp these out. And I'm going to stamp these with Blackout ink by Ink on 3. Now, this one stamp set, the Holiday Penguins, is a brand new stamp set. The Penguins in Paradise I've had for a couple of years and I can't part with it. I just love it. But I'm going to stamp these first 3 with the Blackout ink, and I'm going to stamp them twice just because that one stamp set is fairly new. I want to make sure that I get a really good image. Then I can mask these out with my Simon Says stamp masking paper, move my paper around and stamp the remaining 2 images. Now this one little penguin that is wearing the little antlers with the ornaments hanging down, you can see that once I stamp this and mask this out, I did not put myself through the agony of trying to cut out those little antlers. I figured they're really tiny, they're really skinny, and I'm just going to just not mask them, and I'm going to color directly over my ink blended area. So I masked out the rest of his little body and then finished off with this final image of this little penguin holding the present. Once again, stamped that out twice and then masked that out. Now, as far as my ink blending goes, I'm going to be using a mixture of Distress inks and Distress oxides. And there's one main reason for that is because you can't color over Distress oxides. You can, but you're not going to be able to really do any kind of blending. So I'm going to do my sky, any part that I don't have any coloring over it, I'm going to use the Distress oxides. So first I'm going to mask out the bottom portion of my card panel with some Post-it note tape, and I'm going to be using the Salty Ocean, Mermaid Lagoon, and Faded Jeans oxides for my sky. So I'm just going to lay out some of that Faded Jeans towards the bottom right along where that masked area is, and then I'll go in with my other 2 colors. Now, the first time around, I'm not really worried about blending them. I'm just kind of getting my paper saturated, and then I'll kind of go back and forth between the 3 colors to make sure that they really blend. Now, with the Distress oxides, just keep in mind that they lay on top of the paper for a while. They sit on top of the paper and kind of eventually soak their way in, from what I can tell. So they stay wet a really long time, but that makes your blending a lot easier. You have a lot more time to work with it. So once that's done, I'm going to remove that Post-it note tape. Some of my mask from my palm tree did stick, so I tried to pull it from the other end. That part was sticking as well. So I was just super careful, kind of stuck my fingers underneath there to make sure that everything stayed in place, the parts that I needed to stay in place anyway. So I'm going to take a eraser now, and I'm going to very, very lightly get rid of those pencil lines. Now, when I did that ink blending for the sky, I put my mask just above the pencil line because I knew once I did my ink blending over it, I wasn't going to be able to erase it. Now, the ink will take a couple of seconds to dry or a couple of minutes to dry, and then I can mask it out. If you try to mask it out right away, you're mask won't stick because it's wet ink. So you can see that I have just a tiny, tiny bit of that poking through. You want to make sure that you have that just barely showing, or else you're going to have kind of a white outline between your water and your sky. So next I'm going to go in with Antique Linen, and this is regular Distress ink. And this is going to be my sand. And you can see that I have to really work with this. I am really scrubbing that ink pad. I have had this ink pad since I started crafting many, many, many years ago, and I've never re-inked it. I don't have any of the re-inkers, and it's just not something that I think to buy. But now I'm going to remember. But I definitely need a new one or a re-inker for it. But I was able to get at least most of the color down. Next, I'm going to move back to some Distress Oxides and use Broken China and Peacock Feathers for my ocean. And you can see that I didn't mask out my sand because you wouldn't really have that harsh line. The sand would kind of blend in with the water on the shoreline. So that's pretty much what I'm doing. I'm going to put that Broken China towards the back along where the mask is, and then blend that out with the Peacock Feathers. And I'm kind of just fading that out right into that Antique Linen to make it look as if the water's kind of coming up on shore. And these will blend, the Distress inks and the Distress Oxides. It's just going to give you a little bit different of a finish. The oxides will give you more of a chalky finish, where the regular Distress inks will give you more of a smoother finish. Well, not really smoother. I don't know. Kind of a duller finish, if that makes any sense. So next I can remove all of my masks, and typically I would cut this out, but I know many people like to see the masks being removed. So I kept this part in there. Now, before I start my coloring of the images, I wanted to add a little bit of texture and some detail to the water itself. So I am going to take a white gel pen, and you'll want to make sure that you're using a gel pen that has that isn't too dry. I like to stick with, I cheap out on a lot of things. Let me tell you, I like to cheap out on a lot, but my white gel pen, I don't. So I am forgot about this. I'm stamping some of the ornaments for the penguins to be holding and some of the ornaments coming off of the tree. Now I'm going to go in with that white gel pen. So I use the Uniball Signo white gel pen, and I love this gel pen. I will never go back to anything else. And I'm just going to kind of scribble along that shoreline where the water meets the sand. And while it's still wet, I'm just taking my finger and kind of smearing it. Now I'm trying to go around my images, because once it goes over your images, your coloring it's going to kind of resist your coloring. Not completely, but it will a little bit. Now I'm also going to go back along the entire ocean area and kind of just randomly scribble some scribbles. And once again, while it is still wet, I'm just going to smear that with my finger, and this will just add some kind of waves to your ocean. So next we are going to move on to the coloring. So I'm going to start with the penguins, and I'm going to use some warm grays for the penguins. I'm going to start out with their bellies and their faces, which would be more white, but anything white still has shadows. And I'm not actually coloring these white. They're just going to be a very, very light gray. So I'm just going to add some shadows with my W5 and W3, using those colors very, very sparingly. And then I'm going to bring in the W1, and I'm going to fill in the entire area. Now it looks a little bit weird right now because it is clearly gray, but once I finish up the coloring, it will look white, I promise you. So take a mental note of what it looks like now, and once the card is all done, you'll notice how white it actually looks. So for the rest of the penguin's body, obviously this is the black part of their body. I'm going to go right in with my black marker and just add my darkest areas. So I'm pretty much concentrating either side of their heads and kind of coming up from their beak, and on the inside of their arms. Anytime you have anything hanging over another, so anything overlapping, is going to create a shadow. Going to blend that out with the W7, then the W5, and I'm leaving a very, very small area for the W3 for the highlight color, just to kind of bring in that contrast, because you don't get a whole lot of contrast with grays unless you go real dark and real light. So I colored the other penguins pretty much the same way, same color combination, so I'm not going to show you all of that. Next, I'm going to bring in some E50 markers for the, would it be the trunk of the tree? I mean, I don't know if you call a palm tree the trunk, but that's what we're going to call it. We are going to add a little bit of shading to either side because it would be a round object. And then in between each one of these sections, I'm just adding a little bit, a line, just a line, because they kind of are sections. They kind of overlap one another. Going to blend that out with the E57, E55, and finish off with the highlight for the E53, which isn't a whole lot of room except when we get towards the bottom, but this is what's really going to bring in that contrast. Now for my greens, I'm going to go right in with my darkest color, which will be the G99, and I'm going to add some shading towards the base and the tip. And I'm also going to kind of pay attention where one is overlapping another and may possibly add a little bit of a shadow there as well. But I'm using some flicking motions here just to kind of leave some texture on the tree. I'm going to extend those flick lines with the G94, and then I'll finish off with the G43 just in the center of each of these leaves. I guess they'd be leaves, right? And I did the same thing to the other side. So once again, there's a lot of repetition in this card, so I'm not going to show you all of the coloring as long as you guys get the idea of what I did for each part of the card. So this is where I realized I forgot the beaks and their little feet of the penguins. So I'm going to go in with a YR07, YR04, and a Y15 for the highlight color. I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to the base and kind of work my way up. The very top would be the highlight color. So next we are going to move on to all of their little accessories. For these antlers, I'm just going to go in with a solid color because like I said, it wasn't masked out, and why bother to do any shading when it's over the Distress Oxide area? You're not going to be able to notice it anyway. Next, I'm going to color the white areas of the two penguins' hats. And I want to make sure that I do this first before going in with my darker colors, because if they bleed, then there's no taking it away. So again, these are round objects, and they're white, so I'm only adding the shading, but this time I am using some cool grays just so that it doesn't blend in with the rest of the penguins themselves. Of course, I am leaving a ton of white space. I am just simply adding a little bit of a shadow on either side of the hat, as well as the little pom-pom of the hat. So next we are going to move on to the scarf of this penguin all the way off to the left. And I'm going to bring in a different green combination. It's honestly not too far off from the one that I used from the tree, but I didn't want it to be exactly the same. Once again, I am going to concentrate my darkest areas being on either side, and where it's kind of folded on itself a little bit. On either side, there's a flick line, and that's already part of the image. And I'm just going to extend that flick out just a little bit, and that's what's going to give a little bit more shape to it. And again, it's going to look really weird before you actually get it done. But once you get that lightest color in there, it will kind of all come together and make sense. So I am going to use this green combination for part of the present as well, but I wanted to bring in a gold combination first. And being this is such a dark green combination, I wanted to make sure that I added my gold first. Again, just in case my darker colors bled. So I'm going to go in with the E99 just on the base of the ribbons that are wrapped around the present. And then each one of these little loops, I'm just going to add some shading where it's looped around or where it's folded. Blend that out with the Y26 and then finish off with the Y23. Now, while I have these colors out, I'm also going to color in some of the ornaments with this same color combination. Now, some of them are going to be a little bit bolder than others, just for depending on whether they're in front of the Distress Oxides or the regular Distress ink. For the most part, I didn't have too much of an issue because they were pretty much where I was fading out that peacock feather, so there wasn't a whole lot of oxides behind it anyway. So now I can go back in with that same green combination that I used for the scarf for the present itself, the box itself. So I'm going to add a little bit of shading on the corner of the box and towards the back of the box to kind of give it some shape so it doesn't look like a flat image. And I'm also adding a little bit of shading coming up from the base of the box, just like I did for the ribbons. There's really no rhyme or reason for where I'm placing these shadows, but I'm just keeping them consistent. So as long as my shading is the same for the ribbon and the present, it will look okay. So once again, it's going to look a little wonky until you finish off with that lightest color. So next I'm going to bring in my reds, which is always the last thing that I finish off with. And I'm going to color this little Santa hat. This is bent over, so I'm adding that little flick line to make sure that I keep that shape. Also adding a little bit of shading on either side. I am going right in with my darkest color for all of these because there is Distress Oxides in the background and I don't want my colors to bleed. You can't use a colorless blender on Distress Oxides. So I also used the same red combination for the other Santa hat as well as the other ornaments, the remaining ornaments. And I'm just keeping a center highlight for the ornaments. So I just added my darkest color on the outside because once again, they are round objects and they are pretty tiny. So you don't have to worry about too much shading here. So next I need to fill in some areas. So in between these little loops of the gift here, well, first I did the top of the ornaments gray. I wait a day or two to do my voiceovers and then I forget what I did. So I'm going to take a super light color just to fill in between these loops that were not masked. And then I'm going to add some shadows underneath each one of my penguins. So I'm going to start off with, and I wish I didn't go quite so dark because my antique linen was so dry. The sand is very light. So I am going to darken it up a little bit. I wouldn't have started with the E37 had I realized it was going to look so dark. But anyway, I did, and I'll show you how I kind of toned it down. So I always start with the darkest color when I do shadows, and this is another reason why I use the Distress ink, because I knew I was going to be adding shadows. So I added some kind of just, there's really no way of doing shadows right or wrong way. I'm kind of just scribbling underneath each one of these objects, or each one of these penguins, I should say, and then kind of working my way down to the lightest color, and I just extend it out as I go. But I do go right over the darkest color, which I don't typically do when I'm doing normal coloring, but I am for this because it will kind of muddy it up and look more like a shadow rather than a colored image. So it was looking far too dark. So I ended up bringing in that E42, which is super light, and I went over the entire thing. And like I always say, the lighter the color, the more it's going to act as a colorless blender. And it did. It certainly toned it down. But I still wasn't liking it. So I decided to add some shading to the part of the sand that's furthest away. But I didn't go quite so dark. I started with the E33, E31, E42, and I was still left with a really harsh line. So I ended up bringing in a colorless blender and kind of just getting rid of that harsh line. I'm not going over the entire thing, but I did kind of just tone that down so it's more of a seamless blend. As I moved towards the left-hand side, I didn't go quite as dark, but I did add a little bit of shading, and I liked that much better. I felt like it all came together once I added that. So I'm going to add a few white gel pen details, some highlights, some polka dots on the present, and then I will finish off with the sentiment. I'm going to put this right in the center and stamp this with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink right above my palm tree Christmas tree. So that is it. That is the card for today. Today's collaborator is Kendra, who is also making a tropical themed Christmas card for us. So I will link her channel below, as well as all of the supplies that I used in today's card. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.